we need our wounds that have been redeemed by God to witness to his power. And that's some of the reason why he allows our suffering. He doesn't ever cause it. He doesn't ever, he's not cursing us. But if it is allowed, it is because it has that potential to be touched by him such that it becomes a powerful vehicle to conversion and healing for others.
Welcome to Matters of Soul Importance, where we dive deeply into topics of both earthly and eternal consequence. I'm Roxanne Solonen, faith columnist and features writer for The Forum, author and speaker. In this episode, we ask the question, can suffering ever be good? Could there ever be any value to suffering, or should we avoid it at all costs? To help answer this difficult question, I've turned to a fellow author friend, Elizabeth Kelly, whom I met in March of 2019 at a women's conference in the Twin Cities. Her talk on beauty stirred my heart and led me to seek out more of her work. Liz had shared at that conference that she lives with multiple sclerosis, and more recently, I learned about her journey through cancer. I knew Liz would be able to handle this question with depth and grace, and so I'm pleased she agreed to converse on this topic from her Minnesota home. With that, let's see what gems Liz has to offer. Well, hello, Liz, and thank you for joining us by phone today.
Thanks for having me.
And where exactly are you? I know you're in the Twin Cities somewhere.
Yes, I'm in White Bear Lake. I'm sitting in my living room, and the sun is pouring in, and we had this huge snow last night. So everything's just covered in white. I wish I could blink you into my living room. It's quite relaxing right now.
we had that snow a couple days ago, but right now the sun is streaming in, and in my office it kind of comes in this one window and shines on me. Sometimes it's almost too bright, but I just feel that, especially in the winter, you feel that glorious warmth. And
yeah.
It's awesome. Yes. So I'm glad you're enjoying that today too, because it's been a pretty gray winter.
It has. This bright sun and snow is really refreshing.
Yes. Well, today we're going to ask the question in this podcast, can suffering ever be good? And while I'm not happy that you've become something of an expert on the topic of suffering. I know that's probably not what you signed up for, but
oh no, that's funny.
I am grateful to know that someone as thoughtful as you would be willing to share your experiences, because it's not an easy topic. I think it's one that, we all suffer and we all struggle through that. And I think often that can be a hindrance to faith, right? I mean, that can be a real block. Yeah.
Sure.
So, and we're all human, and there's no way around it. Like, it is hard. And so, but suffering isn't all your life has been about. So maybe before we begin, you can tell us a little bit about yourself and your work. So go ahead and share the highlights.
I knew I wanted to be either a writer or a singer, probably pretty early on, and I did a combination of both for a while, but I eventually settled more on writing, and I did a master's in writing. And then after my first couple of books, I learned along the way that I had a real facility to write about the life of the spirit, and that it was very helpful to people. And so I started writing more about that, and I realized if I wanted to go deeper, I needed better intellectual formation. And so I left my job at Harvard, and I went to the University of St. Thomas, where I did the master's in Catholic Studies. And then when I finished that, they just kind of acquired me. We were a very good fit. And so I ran their academic journal, Logos, for about 14 years. And then I taught in the undergraduate and the graduate program in Catholic Studies. And just continued writing throughout that whole period. And I got certified as a spiritual director throughout that time. And a year or two ago, I left my university position so that I could pursue speaking and leading retreats full time. I I was working so much, and I found that I couldn't work all weekend and then come into the office on Monday. So one of those things had to go, and I very reluctantly gave up my university position because I loved working in Catholic studies. It's just a remarkable group of people. I just miss my colleagues a lot and my students. But so now that's what I do full time is I travel and I lead retreats and I speak for women's conferences, and I continue to write books. I've got a little over a dozen now under my belt, and one or two of those had been co-authored. So I love what I do. I love doing women's ministry, and I have the best job in the world.
Well, it might be helpful to explain too how I met you, because you were a guest or you were a keynote speaker at the Women in the New Evangelization Ministry. And in 2019, I believe I went to that conference with women, and you were the first speaker. And you spoke about beauty, as I recall, which was, we actually did a podcast episode not too long ago about can beauty save the world. So this kind of fits in with that. But you spoke so eloquently about it. And then I ended up buying your Jesus Approaches package, and then kind of lost it. And then during COVID, it reappeared. And it turned out to be the perfect thing that I was able to lead a little group in going through that beautiful study, which focuses on women in the New Testament, which it just was really enriching. And then I was able to go to, you gave a talk here in North Dakota, retreat using that same book as a model. So
yes,
it's just a beautiful and award-winning study, I guess you could say, about going deep into the heart of women and who we are and what we are. So yeah, so that's how I got to know you. And one of the things you're just talking about your work at the university. I remember you telling a story, but I'll let you tell it. Your office was either up by an adoration chapel or something, and because you gave spiritual direction too, right? Or that was
yes.
Share a little bit about that, because I'm always so envious that you had such a prime place.
Oh yes, it was interesting because the first year that I started working in Catholic studies in 2008, the building was undergoing a renovation. And actually, before I even started working there, when I was still a graduate student, someone had brought in the plans, the architectural drawings, and I was sort of looking at them, and I saw where they were putting the new chapel. And I just kind of as a joke, I pointed to the office that was directly above the altar and said, if I could have an office in this building, I would have it right here.
So
and
you
then
requested that.
Yeah. So then, a year or so later, they hired me and I started working, and then the renovation actually started. And a few months after that, my boss came in and he said, we're assigning offices. What office do you want? And I said, I want that one. And I pointed right to that same office. And so literally my desk was above the altar, 2 floors below it. But during the semester, students would hold perpetual adoration. And on Mondays, they held it all day in the Center for Catholic Studies chapel. And so it was just such a beautiful reminder every day that I came in and I literally placed my work on the altar. It was just like, you have to touch this. This is my sacrifice to you today. It's just all the work that I do, and please make it holy and worthy. And yes, it was a remarkable thing. Not many lay people get to work in an environment where the Eucharist is in repose, and there every day. And at every moment I was working. So it was really just an incredible gift.
Maybe you could explain to our non-Catholic listeners what exactly that means to have the Eucharist in repose.
Sure. So as Catholics, we believe that Jesus is really and truly present in the Blessed Sacrament. And one of the devotions that has grown out of centuries and centuries of worship and prayer in the church is called Eucharistic Adoration. And that's where we actually have the Eucharist visible in a monstrance on the altar. And so people can come in and pray all day with the real presence of Christ. And so when we say that he is in repose, we just mean that the Blessed Sacrament is in the tabernacle. And that's why when you walk into a church, there's a candle burning. That represents that. That tells you Jesus is here in the tabernacle.
Yeah, what a blessing. Well, you had those enriched years, and then there were some sufferings along the way.
Yeah.
So maybe you can. I remember at the conference you had mentioned that you have MS. So that was the first thing that I knew that you were suffering through. But what has been your journey of touching the wounds of Christ?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we all have them. And I don't want to make it sound like mine are extraordinary or anything, but I was married very, very briefly, ended up in a very troubled, very difficult marriage. And the pain of divorce is, I would never wish that on anyone. I've had cancer twice. I have MS. I mean, I've had a lot of like physical suffering. It doesn't come close to the pain of divorce. And my heart just goes out to people who are suffering that. I got married very late in life, and there were some really serious problems that presented immediately. And, we didn't even live in the same house together for a year. But that was just a tremendous pain for me and for my ex-husband. It certainly wasn't just me who was affected by it. And many years later, we went through the annulment process. We were both very concerned and it was important to us that we allow the church to judge our actions. One of the great pains about divorce is that it doesn't just affect you, it affects your family, it affects your friends, it affects your church community. It's just, this is why God hates it. It's just so painful. And so we were very much in agreement that, we wanted to present our case before the church and allow them to make a determination. And they did grant us a declaration of nullity. But that was that was just a really terrible season. And my ex-husband, may he rest in peace, has since deceased, and we were able to reconcile to the degree that we were able before he passed away. And so I was very, very grateful for that. And I have no doubt that he is in heaven. I'm just absolutely very, very confident. He was a man who was seeking the Lord. And sometimes, like David sending Uriah to the front lines to be killed so he could have Bathsheba. I mean, sometimes really devout people can make very egregious errors. And so, but there's no doubt in my mind that he's in heaven. Still, that was a really difficult, painful thing. And then it was a few years after that I was definitively diagnosed with MS. I had known for probably about 10 years I was having weird symptoms like so many people with MS do. And my sister has MS and my uncle had MS, and they are finding that there is a genetic tie with it. And so it wasn't a complete surprise when I was finally diagnosed. It was almost a relief. It's like, okay, I'm not crazy. I am having these weird symptoms because there's something going on in my brain, in my spine.
What are some of the weird symptoms? Just out of curiosity.
Yeah. So the first weird symptom that I had, like that was really definitive. I had numbness, tingling, kind of weird neurological. My balance felt off, for probably 20 years. But then I started to go blind in one eye, which is a really classic defining first diagnosable symptom of MS. And it was weird because it doesn't happen all at once. You don't like wake up and you're blind in one eye. It happens gradually. And that's even weirder. You're like, okay, is there something on my eye? What's going on? And so, I went, basically completely blind in one eye. But the good thing is that my vision came back very, very quickly. And I attribute that to my dear friend, my good friend, Father Stephen, who came and anointed my eye. And he came on like a Thursday night or something. And I went and saw the neurologist on Friday, and my eye was already starting to improve. So I think anointings are really important, especially when your priest is so holy. So my vision came back. And at that point, they were like, well, you might have MS, you might not. We can't really diagnose you yet, blah, blah, blah. So I just went on living with my life. And then about 5 years later, I started to go numb from about the waist down, but only on the back side of my legs, as weird as that is. And I can remember this because one day I was sitting in adoration, and I couldn't get comfortable because I was like numb, and it's like I'm sitting, I can't get comfortable. I feel so weird. And then the Lord was like, kneel down, you big dummy. And I did. And of course, I could feel the front of my legs. I could feel the front of my body perfectly. So kneeling was the perfect position to pray because it didn't, distress any of the weird part of my body that was malfunctioning. So God really has a sense of humor. And,
Yes.
I just think of that often. It's just like, oh, he gave me a perfect way to get comfortable and pray. Happens to be on my knees. Thank you very much. So that was perfect. So, and that came back, that feeling came back, but that was kind of like the definitive, at that point they could see it in my brain. And then I went on meds after that. And I've had a very, very, God's been very generous with me. My case has been very mild, and I've been able to continue to work, and I can walk and exercise and, do all those sorts of things. I'm tired. I have to sleep a lot, but that's very manageable compared with what some people suffer with it.
Yeah. Before we go on to the next part, which is the cancer, I want to circle back to the divorce. You said that pain was more difficult than the physical suffering.
Oh, yes.
Can you
yes.
I just want to hear a little bit about that because not everyone understands what that means. And
sure. I think, the whole proposition of marriage is that you want to build a life with another person, and you give your heart over to that person for them to receive and to accept and to build a life with. And then in divorce, it's like you're asked to take your heart back. and that's impossible. Once your heart has been given, it has been given. And so there's a very deep grieving that goes on when your heart has been offered and has not been received. For whatever reason, maybe it can't be received. Maybe there's an impediment. Maybe there's, who knows? I'm not trying to judge anybody in that situation. Every divorce has a different character, but the deep grieving of that. And I'm a really devout Catholic. Divorce there was no way I would ever get divorced. That was just not in my mind. I was just not. That was not something. It would be like murder to me. It's like I'm not going to pull the trigger and kill somebody. It's just something I would never, ever, 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 ever do. And yet, here I found myself in this terrible pain, and the rejection in that, it helps you to understand Christ on the cross and the rejection that he felt. Here he is coming and saying, I love you, I love you, I love you. And people are saying, we hate you to death. We're going to put you to death. And divorce is can be a similar thing where you're saying, I love you, I want this to work. And instead you're getting, no, I reject it. So it's a terrible pain, terrible, terrible pain. But I will say this, God uses that. He will use it. He will heal it. And like his own scars, we know We don't have to be afraid of our woundedness. We don't have to be afraid of our scars. We know that in the resurrected body of Christ, he still bore the wounds of the crucifixion. So if I still bear some of the wounds of the things that have happened to me, especially the sins that maybe have been committed against me, I don't have to be afraid of that, because those wounds, touched by God, redeemed by God, can bear witness just like they did to Thomas, the doubting apostle. So, and that's one of the things that divorce taught me, is that, I was so ashamed of it for so long, and God really healed that. And I felt so guilty for so long because it was such a terrible sin and it hurt so many other people, and God, healed that. But he's also just teaching me that the wounds that we carry are a witness to God's work in our life. So they can become points of contact, just like Thomas put his hand in the side of Christ. He said, I want to put my hand in the wound of his side. They can become touch points for other people to approach us and talk about their wounds, their own fears, their own doubts. We need our wounds that have been redeemed by God to witness to his power. And that's some of the reason why he allows our suffering. He doesn't ever cause it. He doesn't ever, he's not cursing us. But if it is allowed, it is because it has that potential to be touched by him, such that it becomes a powerful vehicle to conversion and healing for others.
Wow. And the thing is, I don't think we don't have to have gone through divorce to understand what you're saying about wounds.
Sure.
Right?
Absolutely.
Or rejection. Everyone.
Absolutely. Sure.
Yeah. So what you're touching on touches everyone. And to think that you can make something so painful into something so beautiful.
Yeah.
Here we are in Lent right now, and this is a time, like one of my Lenten commitments is to just read a little bit from a meditation. It's St. Alphonsus Liguori, and I don't know a lot about him, but I'm learning to reflect on the crucifix, which is such a scary thing. Who wants to do that? Like, I want to run the other way from that, but
of course,
like you're saying, like, no, like draw toward it, and you'll find healing, you'll find love, you'll find acceptance, and so anyway, there's just so much here, and what a perfect time to talk about it. So.
Yeah. It's a good segue. Just in, I had a book that came out last year on meditations on the last words of Christ, and a few months after that, I got diagnosed with cancer. It was my second time. The first time I had breast cancer, we did very little. We just did kind of the lumpectomy, and then we just said, well, we're going to wait. All the edges are clear, blah, blah, blah. I was stage 0, Okay. And then it came back 6 years later. And this time, because they kept such a close eye on me, they still found it really early. It was stage 1. And, but, once I had surgery and they got a look at the tumor, and they were like, yeah, chemo is probably really going to be a good idea for you because it will lower the chance of it recurring. The kind of tumor it was, the kind of cancer it was, it's likely to come back. So let's do a little chemo and just like kill the cancer cells if any of them escaped, that kind of thing. So I was like, oh no. Chemo, surgery is one thing. And, I avoided radiation because I had surgery, and I was so praying, Lord, please don't make me go through chemo. I'm such a wimp when it comes to nausea and, all that.
Me too. Yeah, I get it.
And so when I knew I had to go through it, I knew I was not going to get through it well unless I put it to work. So I made a very clear decision. God made it very clear to me that I needed to offer up that suffering for other people and for their intentions. And so, I sent out an email, and over social media and other places, I was like, I'm starting a chemo notebook. If you have intentions, send them to me, and I'm going to offer up my chemo for this. So, the intentions just poured in, and I just scribbled every one in my little chemo notebook. I'll never throw it away. I'll keep it. I'll probably be buried with it. And I started, even before chemo, I started praying for all of these intentions every day. And it was just so powerful and so helpful to me. I felt like I was going into this battle really well prepared. I had on the armor, I had on a mission, I had a cause. It wasn't just going to be me alone in my bed throwing up. And so then I get into chemo, and I did not have very much nausea, some of like the more typical symptoms, but what I had when I didn't know was even a possibility was bone pain. And that was awful. It was debilitating, for a couple of days at least out of each round of chemo. And so after I'd gone through the first round, I was and had recovered a little bit. I was sitting with my husband in adoration, and I had my chemo notebook with me. And I love our adoration chapel because my husband, who's an architect, designed it. And so I always feel like I get to go in this beautiful place designed by my beloved husband to pray with my beloved Lord. It's a special place to me. And I was sitting there with my chemo notebook before this crucifix, and it's a living crucifix. Jesus is looking down at you, and his eyes are open. And I kind of held up my notebook and I said, Lord, how do I pray with this when I'm in pain? I don't know how to do it. I'm just in so much pain. How do I pray when I'm in this much pain? And very clearly in my heart, he said, pray the way I prayed when I was in pain. And all of a sudden it was like, oh, right. What were you saying from the cross? What were your prayers from the cross? And of course, the first one is, Father, forgive them. He's in tremendous pain, and the first thing he's asking for is forgiveness. So I go back to my little notebook, and I'm looking through all of the intentions and looking at all of the different intentions that are somehow related to forgiveness. Either someone needs to offer it or receive it. And there were so many. There were so many around forgiveness. And so on the really hard pain days, I just hug my little notebook and say, Lord, unleash your forgiveness. Unleash your forgiveness wherever it's needed. That I could do, that I could say. And then you go to the next word. And the next word is, today you're going to be with me in paradise. So we think what happened is the good thief sees the Lord, hears him asking for forgiveness for his persecutors, and that this launched his conversion. His conversion was so real, so deep, so authentic, that the Lord said, today you will be with me, not in purgatory or after some time or later on. No, today you're going to be with me in paradise. That's how clearly the good thief recognized the Lord as God and Savior. It was so pure. So I went back to my notebook and I said, all right, where's conversion needed? And there were so many people praying, send my children back to the faith, bring my children back to the church, bring my loved ones back to the church. So many people praying for conversion, or even their own strengthening of conversion. So I was like, all right, clearly this is another, grace that is unleashed when you're in pain. So I was praying for all those conversions, and I could do that. So it was, what I have discovered in all of this is that one of the things is that God is not immune to our pain. He's not detached from it. He is in it. And if we will offer it to him, he will put it to work. The crucifixion is the means of our redemption. That terrible pain and suffering is the means of our redemption. And when I can give him my pain and suffering, he can make it redemptive the same way he made the cross, the crucifixion redemptive. And so I don't want pain and suffering. I don't want the cancer to come back. But if it does, I feel like I know what to do with it. I know, God's given us the roadmap. When you're in pain, here's one thing you can do. Don't let it go to waste. Don't let it go to waste. Put it to work. Put it in his hands, and he's going to make it something so glorious, so beautiful. And I have to tell you, Roxanne, there just have been some extraordinary answers to prayer for the little prayers that I had scribbled in my notebook. And I may be just the tiniest little part of that, but I'm just so honored by that, that I could be a tiny little contributor to the answer in that prayer.
Well, I have some watery eyes right now. I don't know. I'm just listening. Usually I'm more like thinking of the next question, but I'm just listening and taking it in. And for one thing, you've been helpful because a spiritual director recently suggested some different kind of journaling for me in adoration, where I used to just write a little love letter to Jesus and kind of tell him about my day and thank him and different things. But he suggested, and this was the first time last night where I tried it, and I was a little bit uncertain about it, which was to just open the notebook and just ask a question, and then see what comes back. And I'm struggling with that. And so I was honest about that. But I think what you just described is going to help me. I think I need to go into his word somewhere and find out. I think that will be the conduit for me hearing from him, because sometimes I'm just like, I don't because I don't want to take his place and pretend I know what he's saying. That's my block right now. Like, right. I don't know what you're saying. You're God. Like, how can I channel that, Yeah. But I think it's maybe I'm making it too complicated. So.
Well, and I think too, that's a very good instruction from your spiritual director, and I would never contradict it. I think that's an excellent thing to do. But that doesn't mean that you can't first empty yourself a little bit. I used to do the exact same thing, but I'd first spend a few minutes talking about my day, kind of getting settled, getting it all out. Then I'd turn to a blank page and I'd say, okay, your turn.
Okay. Yeah. Yes.
And that sort of helped me, a little bit to move into that exercise. And don't forget, Roxanne, how many hours you have spent studying the Word of God, and His Word is in you. And when we ask Him to come, He does. The Bible's the only book you're ever going to crack open where the author is in the room.
Yeah.
And when you're at adoration, you're with the author. So you can have confidence that the things that he impresses upon your heart, he is impressing those things, and he's going to affirm it. He'll repeat it. You'll talk to your spiritual director and he'll affirm it. And,
one thing I think, because I am a cantor as well, and I know you have been. And so there's so many songs and psalms that come to my heart that I know the tune as well.
Yes.
That's such a gift to have those. Yeah.
And there will be some times when he's just really quiet, when there's not a lot of talking going on, when you've got more of, what Mother Teresa would describe, I look at him, he looks at me, that,
but just having his presence there, just not going through things alone, having the God of the universe right there. Just to let that, hold you, really, So, well, I think we'll take a little pause here, regroup, and then we'll come back in. And I think I want to have you go into even more of what redemptive suffering is, because I think that's a concept that is a little strange to a lot of people. And it's something we can always contemplate. So we will take a pause, and we'll be back in a few moments.
Get 3 months of local news for just 99 cents a month. You'll get unlimited access to the news you need to stay engaged and connected to your community. Visit inforum.com/subscribe now to get 3 months of local news for only 99 cents a month.
Welcome back to Matters of Soul Importance. I'm Roxanne Solonen, talking with Liz Kelly this morning, and she is sharing a little bit about her journey through some suffering times and also what she's learned from that about God's love for her. And so the question we're asking is, can suffering ever be good? And I think we've gotten a glimpse now to answer that with a yes. It's not an easy yes necessarily. We don't run to suffering. We don't like it when other people's suffering. But one of the beautiful thoughts about suffering, and I think I've brought it up on our podcast before, but I think it was John Paul II that said, "Suffering unleashes love." Mm-hmm. And I don't know what you think about that, Liz, but have you heard? I'm sure you've heard that before.
Oh,
what are your thoughts
my gosh,
about it?
Yeah, on the meaning of human suffering, the Christian meaning of human suffering is one of my favorite JP2 documents. And I quote that all the time. If suffering had a vocation, that would be it, to unleash love. And it so does this. I'll give you a perfect example. So 2 weeks after my surgery, I had a double mastectomy. It was very, very hard. It was really painful, and it was much harder than I thought it was going to be. My husband gets laid off. So now we're like waiting for chemo. We've got no income because I'm not working, and he just got laid off. So it was a really hard time. And, my poor sweet husband, who's just the most wonderful guy in the world, it ended up being a blessing because he was there to take care of me during chemo. And then my last round of chemo, which was going to be the worst because, it gets cumulatively harder. He got a job, thank the Lord, a much better job that he enjoys more, paid better benefits, all that. So 2 of my sisters, I have 4 sisters and 2 brothers, 2 of my sisters volunteered using their own resources to fly here to take care of me during my last really hard chemo. And you talk about unleashing love. Oh my goodness. They were so attentive. And, my sister Mo, I just remember her doing all of my laundry and like bringing me warm blankets from the dryer and putting them on me in the days when I was had so much pain and I couldn't do anything, or in the days when I couldn't eat anything but like a vanilla milkshake. She'd go get me a fresh vanilla milkshake, and that's all I could stomach. My sister Anne, came and she cleaned and she walked the dogs, and she just, they were just so attentive to me. It was a living visitation. It was just a living visitation where they came to their elderly sister Elizabeth, in her suffering, and just unleashed love. But it came back to them too. I could see how their caring for me was blessing them. And that's always the way it is. It's like a blessing for one person isn't a curse for another. It's God magnifies blessing. He magnifies it. So their caring for me blessed me. And, my praying and thanking and being grateful for their help blessed them. And it really, for both of them, I think, watching me go through this, watching my husband go through all of this strain and stress of just being laid off and then getting a job. And then, it's just a lot going on. It strengthened their faith. It renewed them in their faith. So, God just doesn't waste anything. If we offer our suffering to him, if we ask him to put it to work, that's what he does with it. He unleashes love in the world. He unleashes grace through it.
And love is circular, as I'm hearing you, talk about that. Like there's always movement, even if
Mm-hmm.
perhaps it's not received, there's still movement.
Mm-hmm.
There's still an outflowing, that's how we exist, is that God is love and poured out into love, which created the world. It's just,
Mm-hmm.
there's so much beauty there. So what would you say, though? Because I think there's still some out there who might really be frustrated with suffering, and just, they might think, how could a good God ever
Yeah,
allow this?
you
Like,
bet.
forget it. I'm not going to sign up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How do you respond to that?
Yeah, my husband and I say the rosary every night at 7 p.m. Central with Father Rocky on Relevant Radio. And it started during COVID, and it has kept on, and people will call in with their intentions. And there's so many people who call in with children who have cancer or, some really terrible disease. And I just think, it's fine. I'm in my 50s. I got cancer. It's not that big a tragedy. But when a 2-year-old has a tumor in his brain, it's just like, come on, God, what's going
Mm-hmm.
on? And that is a perfectly legitimate question. We do not need to be afraid of lamentation of any kind. So Jesus on the cross, he's in terrible pain. One of the last words that he said was, my God, why have you abandoned me? And because he can say that word, because he can cry out that way, that sanctifies and legitimizes every time I cry out that way. And we want to pay attention to two different things. There's a very common pattern in lamentation in the Psalms. That is, it's played out in Psalm 21 or Psalm 22, depending on which version of the Bible you use. My God, why have you forsaken me, is the first line of that psalm. And historically speaking, to call on the first line of a psalm was to recall the entire psalm. And like so many psalms of lamentation, what begins with a cry from the heart of, where are you? I'm in terrible pain. It switches to, yet you are holy. In you our fathers trusted, and they were not disappointed. So the fullness of that cry begins in lamentation, but then it moves on to recall the Lord's faithfulness. So from a sort of scholastic perspective, when we look at, my God, why have you abandoned me? The scholars tell us he's recalling the whole psalm. So actually, this is really a cry saying, I trust you. I am not going to be disappointed by you. I am putting my faith in you. You are holy.
So,
But,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
well, I was going to say,
I was going to say, when we're at that place, how do we do that? How do we switch over when the emotions are so strong?
Yeah. I think this teaches us a couple of things. First of all, the Psalms are filled with lamentation. They're filled with lamentation. Where are you? I'm in pain. I'm being persecuted. My enemies are at the gate. I'm starving. I'm thirsty, whatever. They're just filled with these kinds of cries. And this teaches us that we do not need to think we're doing something wrong if we cry out that way. The Psalms were inspired and given by God. We could call them God's prayers. So if the Psalms can be filled with lamentation, if I find myself in a season of lamentation, there's nothing wrong with me. This is part of the human condition and something that God has anticipated and understands. So I don't have to fear that. Now, the key is this: you don't want to stay in lamentation. You don't want to stay there. You want to allow that lamentation to carry you into a deeper faith. You want it like a wave to sort of carry you back to the shore of solid land, which is God is faithful, God is good. And many of the Psalms sort of demonstrate that shift. I think the way that Jesus does it on the cross is that he cries out in lamentation, yes, but then he dies in total service, in total self-donation. So when I find myself in a season of lamentation, I will cry out, "Where are you? Where are you? Where are you?" But then I want to turn my mind and my attention to, who can I serve? How can I help? We see this so clearly in Mother Teresa. We know now that she had these years of just terrible dryness, just longing for the Lord's presence, not finding comfort. And she would spend her first holy hour in the morning just going, "Where is Jesus? Where are you? I love you. Where are you? I'm in so much pain." And then she'd get up and she'd go out and she'd serve the poorest of the poor. So I think that in the situations when we do find ourselves in this terrible season, if we're able to, we can turn to service. Now, even when I'm in pain, I can do the Lord's service. When I was in terrible pain, asking my sisters for ice packs and ibuprofen and whatever, that was service to them. They were being sanctified by helping me. So even when I'm in terrible pain, I can still live a full life of service by accepting the help that's being given to me, by sanctifying others, by allowing them to care for me. I think a lot of people with progressive illness think about this. It's like at some point I'm going to be just a burden. I'm not going to be able to do anything. People are just going to have to take care of me. And won't that be terrible? Well, no. I mean, it'll be humbling, but it's not humiliating. It'll be humbling, but you are sanctifying people, those people who tend to you.
I was going to ask that earlier, Liz, when you were receiving. Sometimes I find it hard to receive.
Sure.
And so how do you kind of get over that mental block? Or at that point of suffering, are you just like, help me?
Well, I think this is probably why the Lord had kept me on my knees all those years ago when I couldn't feel the back of my legs. I think this is partly why he has allowed so much physical suffering in my life, because it has brought me a humility it has brought me to a place where I can humbly ask for help without feeling humiliated. God's humility, what he calls us to, is not humiliation. It's humility. Humility is understanding right relationship. Humiliation is being quashed like a bug, So, and that's not what humility wants to place us in right relationship with God. You are God. There is no other. I depend upon you. I trust you. You will meet my needs. So I do think that is one of the gifts that suffering brings us, is that it softens us to embrace our humanity and celebrate it, because this is how Jesus chose to come to us, is through a man, and through humanity. And that therefore sanctifies humanity. And, Jesus had needs. I forget where it is in which gospel. I think it's in Matthew, where, he's traveling and these women are traveling with him, and these women are providing for him out of their own resources. The women who were traveling with the apostles were probably washing their clothes and keeping them fed. And, they were providing for him out of their own resources. So Jesus had need. He had human need. He needed time with his Father. He went up to the mountain to pray. I mean, he needed food. That's why fasting for 40 days was really, really hard, because he was human. So, we want to allow our needs to teach us about what it means to be humane and humble.
When you were talking about receiving and continuing to give even when you're in terrible pain. I thought of Elizabeth Lesueur. Have you read The Secret Diaries of Elizabeth Lesueur?
Some, yes.
Yeah.
It's been a long time, but yes.
That would be, she's another Elizabeth that suffered so beautifully. And I think, I don't know if there's any other resources that you could mention to people that maybe are in a place of suffering right now that has helped you.
Well, I think one of the most powerful influences in the last few years for me has been getting to know Blessed Benedetta Bianchi Porro. And I write about her in Love Like a Saint. There are many resources available on her online. And she suffered a progressive degenerative illness, died at the age of 27. And I think there's just so much of that right now. People who are suffering similar illnesses that are progressive and degenerative, and then people caring for those with those illnesses. I think she's going to be an extraordinary saint for our time because of that. And she has definitely accompanied me. She has prayed for me. She has taught me so much about how to do this. JP2 is another example. His document on the meaning of Christian suffering is just superb. It's free. It's online. And he's suffering from Parkinson's. He taught us so much about how to suffer well and to just continue doing what you can. And, he went out in front of the crowds drooling. He just was so humble. And those are two people that immediately come to mind. St. Mary MacKillop also had a tremendous amount of suffering in that she was being accused of wrongdoing that she didn't do. So her kind of suffering was, really heart, mental, just that betrayal. And she moved through that with extraordinary sanctity. The books that Father Paul Gardner have written on her are just exquisite. They're delightful. There's so many.
What was the first blessed that you mentioned?
Blessed Benedetta Bianchi Porro, Porro.
Okay, thank you.
And so if you look her up, there's a lot on her online.
Yeah. So, just before we go, maybe a little bit on redemptive suffering, and then I'm going to have you answer the question, can suffering ever be good in a nutshell?
Redemptive suffering. So, Christ teaches from the cross through his own example that his pure sacrifice, his pure suffering, is what brings about eternal life. It's what mediates eternal life for us. Without the cross, there's nothing to talk about. Without the cross and the resurrection, there's nothing to talk about. But because he suffered and died on the cross, he has given us a pathway whereby we can place our suffering in that same path and allow Jesus to redeem it, to make it valuable, to bring about great good through it. Even though something is intended for evil, he can bring about good. His word promises this. We see this happen all the time. And so, even though Christ achieved everything that needed to be achieved on the cross, St. Paul still tells us we can add our suffering to that. We can join it to his, and it can take up that same redemptive quality. That means it can bring about great good through the grace of God.
So I would imagine that your answer is yes. Can suffering ever be good?
Well, I guess I would maybe even reframe the question, because I think in and of itself, suffering is not good. It's terrible. But the question maybe is, can the Lord bring great good and glory from suffering? And absolutely he can, and he will, and he does. And I have such confidence in that. I have such confidence in that. If you are struggling to hope that that is true, just borrow my hope. Borrow the hope of the saints. Borrow the hope of the angels until your own comes back, because it's absolutely true. So if you find yourself struggling to believe that God can bring great good out of whatever it is you're suffering right now, that's okay. Don't worry about it. I'm going to believe in it for you. I'm going to stand in the gap, and I'm going to believe in that for you until you can believe in it yourself. Because that's how the body of Christ works. The Lord put together the body of Christ in a really brilliant way. And that's one of the things that we can do, is we can help carry each other into deeper faith, hope, and love.
Beautiful. If people want to know more about your work, Liz, where can they go to find it?
Yeah, my website is lizk.org, the shortest website in the world, practically. And I'm on Instagram at LizK Today. I don't post a lot on that, but occasionally I do. But LizK Today, lizk.org.
Okay. Well, thank you, Liz, for sharing a bit of your soul journey today. I have a feeling that more than a few listeners of this podcast will be adding their prayers to those rising on your behalf.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. I hope you are blessed by our conversation today as much as I have been. It's been a privilege to talk to you and share about this really important topic of suffering and how we can see it in a better light. So thank you, Liz, and God bless you.
And you, bless you.
Thank you. Can suffering ever be good? Liz reframed the question a bit at the very end, and I think it's a very apt edit, reminding us, and I'm glad she inserted this important point, that suffering isn't good in and of itself. It's not what God intended for us in the beginning, but God writes beautiful stories through our brokenness. So Liz's amendment to my question was, can the Lord bring great glory and good from suffering? Yes, she answered. He absolutely can, and he will, and he does. I hope this discussion has been as edifying for you as it was for me. I knew Liz would come through on this topic in a way few may be able to. God gave her some tremendous gifts, and I'm just so grateful to give her the mic today so that she might share those gifts with others, even while still in the midst of her cancer journey, to bring us hope. We need not fear the crucifixion. It is our hope and glory, if we only take time to delve into what Jesus wanted to offer when he died on Calvary, which is, at bottom, love. Now that is worth drawing toward. We'll return in a couple of weeks with episode 7, when I ask guest Howard Dahl, who was Ann Dahl? Though I knew Ann as a friend and mentor, Howard knew her as a beloved wife and friend, mother of their children, and grandmother to their grandchildren. Ann died in January 2023 at age 76 after a brief, intense illness, but she left behind a gift, years of journals in which she had a conversation with God. She gave in life, and she has given so much also in her death. We will hear a little about the treasures she's left for us to learn from in this conversation, and I know it will warm your hearts. Until then, don't lose sight of the light.